Hi, welcome to Pamela Price Unfiltered. I'm your host, Pamela Price, and this is the space and the place for real talk. This podcast is all about raw, unfiltered conversations on politics, law, culture, education, systemic racism, and current events shaping our world. We'll go beyond the headlines to dive deep into how some of the most pressing issues impact real people, real families, and our communities. My goal is to help you navigate the complexities of today's world. Each episode will tackle an issue, breaking it down in a way that's honest, informative, and actionable. We'll hear from community leaders, lawyers, activists, educators, healers, and everyday people on the front lines of change. For those tuning in for the first time, I'm Pamela Price, a longtime attorney, political activist, and champion for justice. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel to watch the show and to Substack to read the weekly word. Your support keeps the conversation raw and unfiltered. And you can also listen to Pamela Price Unfiltered wherever you get your podcasts. Welcome to the show. Let's talk about it. Welcome to Pamela Price Unfiltered. My guest today is attorney Brian Pomerantz. Brian Pomerantz's desire to work on capital cases originated 6 weeks into law school when he heard one of his Michigan law school professors do a lunch presentation on one of her capital cases out of Chicago. After graduation, Brian assisted Professor Andrea Lyon on some of her cases, including the evidentiary hearing for the one that first caught his attention, before he joined the Los Angeles Federal Public Defender's Capital Habeas Unit. Following 8 years as a federal public defender, Brian began practicing capital habeas litigation as a Criminal Justice Act panel attorney for the past 11 years. Brian Pomerantz currently represents capital defendants in California, Utah, Kentucky, and North Carolina. He has argued capital cases in the Ninth Circuit, the 10th Circuit, the Sixth Circuit, and working with Munger Tolles, a national law firm, successfully opposed Oklahoma's cert petition to the United States Supreme Court in Carl Fontenot's case in 2022. In addition to the 3 Alameda County capital cases where he was lead counsel, in 2024, he and Anne Catherine Tria were appointed as special settlement counsel in 10 capital cases in Alameda County. For their work in these cases, Brian and Anne were awarded the Daily Journal's prestigious Clay Award in May of 2025. And I can say how prestigious it is because I was awarded the Clay Award in 2002. So, Brian, welcome to Pamela Price Unfiltered.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here.
Of course. Now, you and I were adversaries in the capital cases. You were representing the defendants, starting with Mr. Ernest Dykes. We met on the opposite side of the Dykes case. You obviously were very familiar with the case before I became the district attorney, and the judge had to give me a minute to get up to speed. Tell my listeners how you got involved in capital cases in Alameda County.
I got my first Alameda case, Mark Schmeck's case, in 2014. I was appointed to that case with co-counsel Wes Van Winkle for his federal habeas. And that was a case where prior counsel, Larry Gibbs, had brought a claim that Jewish jurors were being improperly struck. And so I was not aware of this history in Alameda until I got Mark's case. But when I got Mark's case and I saw this, I was appalled, intrigued. This was something that clearly caught my eye. I'm Jewish, so for me this was personal as well, and it's a fascinating thing. I've seen improper striking of jurors in cases I've worked across the country. In every jurisdiction you just mentioned, we have claims like this in many of my cases. I have it in striking jurors based on religion in my Utah case, striking black jurors in my North Carolina case, striking jurors based on race in some of my Kentucky cases, and many of my California cases. And so this is something that happens across the country. What was interesting about Alameda was there had been allegations 10 years before I got Mark's case that this was systemic, that this was something that the Alameda County District Attorney's Office had been doing for a long time in a concerted effort in capital cases to keep Blacks and Jewish jurors off juries. And so that was my first introduction to it. 2 years later, I got Charles Stevens' case. Charles Stevens' case is, in my opinion, the most obvious Batson error. Batson is the claim. That's the Supreme Court case where the Supreme Court said you can't strike based on race, or it's the one everyone alludes to, but there's many cases where they've said it. The Batson claim in Charles Stevens' case, I think, is the most obvious in all of Alameda.
Yeah, there were some clear identifying sort of red flags in Ernest Dykes' case when you really took a look at it that made you wonder, that was kind of like the clue that there was something going on. And I find it ironic that you're Jewish and you took this on. We used to comment on how the fact that they never wanted, that the office had a systemic policy of excluding Black women jurors, and now they had a Black woman as the district attorney, and how shocking that must have been to some of the people who were there during that era. Very, very troubling. Yeah, tell my audience about the Batson case, because a lot of people, there was a lot of conversation when this came up that I was somehow making this up and it was my political agenda. But in fact, as you know, we were following the law. So can you tell tell the audience a little bit about what is the Batson case and why is it important in California?
So Batson is really one in a long line of cases, right? It actually starts with Strouder versus West Virginia in 1880. That's when the Supreme Court first said, we can't be striking jurors based on who they are, right? In immutable characteristics, right? And so you had a long line of cases going from Strouder through Batson and all the way up to Flowers versus Mississippi, and it just a handful of years ago, where they've said dozens upon dozens of times, we're not going to strike jurors based on things they can't control. You could strike a juror because of something maybe you don't like where they work. Okay, that's fair. Maybe you don't like their hobbies or what TV shows they watch. That's fair. What's not okay is you can't strike jurors based on what race they are. You can't strike them based on, in California, you can't strike them based on religion. You cannot strike jurors in California based on whether they're gay or lesbian, which is something else that you and I found in these files was they were targeting gay jurors, right? They were targeting gay jurors as well. There also was massive misogyny in these cases, which is another thing. JEV versus Alabama, a case that came out a couple of years after Batson, said you cannot strike based on gender. So the Supreme Court's spoken on that. And so this is something that, following the resumption of the death penalty in California in the late 70s, they very quickly at Alameda figured out that they wanted to get juries that were going to give death, and that they felt certain groups wouldn't give death. So let's get rid of those groups. And that's what was happening for decades.
I think that was the shocking part, was how long it had gone on and how deeply ingrained it was. And the fact that it was so clearly illegal, right? It's so unconstitutional. And you cannot have convictions based on Constitution. I went into the office as a civil rights lawyer, as somebody who spent 30 years supporting and defending the Constitution. And so I know you cannot have an unconstitutional conviction. And it was, disturbing to know that these folks knew the law and figured out ways to get around the law, and it was so normalized and accepted at every level, and even training. I mean, Jack Quatman, the whistleblower, talked about training lawyers across the state. And Alameda County has always had a very, superior, well-respected position as a training office. And so to know that that was embedded in there was really troubling, very troubling. So, one of my deputies, Amy Solway, found the notes in the Dykes case and turned them over to you. And before you received the notes, obviously you knew about the 2005 cover up where Jack Quatman had blown the whistle, right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Had you ever talked to Jack Quatman about what was going on when he was there?
I had not talked to Jack Quatman. I since have spoken with Jack Quatman about it, but I had not talked to Jack Quatman before about it. Something you were saying a few minutes ago, I just want to say, for me, there's no gray area here. You either believe in the Constitution or you do not. And that's the problem here, is you're either subverting justice or you're forwarding justice. And I don't understand. I've never understood. Maybe this is my limited defense attorney thinking, but I've never understood how prosecutors just decide we don't care. We don't care about justice. We don't care about the Constitution. We think we've got our person, and we're going to do whatever it takes to get them. And that's if you got the right guy and if you got the right case, you shouldn't need to cheat to get your conviction, right? It's that simple. You shouldn't need to cheat. If you need to cheat, there's something wrong with the case.
Yeah, then that's the epitome of it. The office had a culture of cheating. We found that out when I ran in 2018, that it was so easy for them to cheat in an election and do things that were unethical and illegal and should not have been done. But it was just fine. It was something, it was normalized within the culture. And I can't help but agree that what was acceptable in these death penalty cases had pretty much seeped into pretty much how they operated in the office, that cheating was absolutely okay. And that's a problem. It is a real problem.
Well, and it was so okay, Pamela, that one of the things that happened is when they had the hearing, when they had the Freeman hearing back in 2005, they lied in the hearing, right? They lied in the hearing about Jack Quatman, right? They created this demonization of the whistleblower. And one of the things that was most amazing to me when we got the Dykes documents from you was that Colton Carmine, the prosecutor in Dykes's case, who clearly had struck Jews and struck Black jurors because they were Jewish, because they were Black. He was one of the absolute key witnesses in the Freeman hearing against Quatman. He had given testimony saying that this guy was doing this, was this, and this guy was that. That was, I think, false. And here you have someone who's saying, no, we're not, we're not striking Jewish jurors. That would be wrong. Right. That hearing took place 10 years after Dykes' trial. Yeah. Right. So he had done this very thing, not only in Dykes' trial. We got notes from Matt Souza's trial where he had done it there too. Right. Very similar notes to what we saw in Dykes' trial. And he's in there demonizing Jack Quatman. And so it's just the testimony that he gave, the testimony that Jim Anderson gave. One of the people who testified in the Freeman hearing was Carol Corrigan, who had been a DA in your former office, and at the time was about to become a California Supreme Court justice, which she still is. What's mind-blowing is she doesn't recuse herself from a lot of these cases. So Giles Nady, one of the 34 Alameda defendants, who's part of this group that you and I were looking at, Giles Nady had an opinion come out from the court just days after your press conference where you opened this up to the world and said the world needs to know this. He gets an opinion where they deny a Batson claim in his case, and she writes the opinion. And it's just that the circle here is unreal. And in that case, you had Justice Liu, who was saying in dissent, wait a second, we just heard from the district attorney that there are issues here. We should put a pin in this. We should be waiting and seeing what happens before we rule against this guy in a way that then can't be undone. But that, and another justice joined him in that, but that didn't happen. Instead, you had a 5-2 opinion where Nady lost. And I think that's not unusual, right? In California, that's not unusual. Justice Liu has been saying for over a decade that court has a problem with Batson, that it's not getting it right on Batson. I think he's even at one point said that they don't understand Batson or aren't following Batson might be more accurate. But I think perhaps my interpretation is they don't understand Batson. But it's disturbing because what we're seeing is some of the same folks who your office looked at these cases and rightfully said, this is clearly wrong. There clearly was a Batson here. Right. Those cases, like Mark Schmeck's, my original client, had gone through the California Supreme Court, and they said, no, nothing here to see, no problem. Well, right there in the transcript, it says in Mark Schmeck's case, you see prosecutor Ted Lanswick is striking the Jewish jurors. He gets challenged on it, and his argument was not, I'm not doing it. His argument was, I'm allowed to do it.
Right. Yeah, we saw that. It was like, okay, the Supreme Court says it's okay, but the Ninth Circuit says it's not. And, we took that into consideration as we looked at the cases. We understood what the law required and that the problem was pretty ingrained. And, I know that you were frustrated with some of the ways that we had to push back, but we had to balance knowing that there's a constitutional violation with trying to ensure that we had to decide, okay, do we retry the case? How do we remedy this wrong, but not, cause harm in other ways to the victims or to the cause of justice? And so that was a challenging situation. And, you and I were in the midst of it. I know you were frustrated, and ultimately I became the new Jack Quatman, right?
You did. And I think, look, we're sitting here today and it would be easy for people to say they were working together on this. And in some ways we were. We were both working toward a constitutional remedy, for a constitutional wrong. Right. But I think you and I would both say, we frustrated each other quite a bit, right? Because it's my job to push back. Anyone who went to any of these resentencings would have seen that there was a lot of this at the resentencings between the people on my side and your office on the right. Even when we agreed on a remedy, very few of these went through without us butting heads on some aspect of it. And that's one of the things that's really interesting now, because the new DA, Ursula Jones Dixon, is suggesting to the courts that you gave these away, that you gave away these things with just willy-nilly, that you were giving away the store. And it was nothing like that.
Nothing like that.
I wish you had. I wish you had, but you didn't, right? These were from our perspective, they went too slowly because you guys spent a long time. I understand from your perspective why you did it. I can't fault you for that. You were right to do it. It just was frustrating for us. You guys spent a long time looking at each one of these cases.
Oh, yeah, we did. And we looked at them in the context of other cases. When you're looking at, I've litigated pattern and practice cases. And so I know when you look over here, you might not see the evidence right in front of you, but it might be over there. And you found that. We all kept seeing that. We saw, and so we were putting together, we had to look at who the lawyers were. You know, what was an Anderson case, right? I mean, what was a Carmine case? You know, at some point, what was a Jacobson case? You know, knowing we had to put together the puzzle and make sure that if there was a lawyer that we knew was dirty and doing dirty things, we needed to know for ourselves how far did that go. And you know, the other thing that your side didn't have to balance was we had to deal with the victims. You know, our responsibility, it was a terrible tragedy for people. And I said that immediately. These folks thought that this person who had harmed their loved one had been convicted and sentenced to death. They had gone through the trauma of the crime. They sat through the trial. You know, I'm sure they testified at the death penalty phase. They were absolutely going to be traumatized the day that we said these convictions are false or they're not. We cannot sustain these convictions. There is a problem. And we had to go through a process to explain to people's loved ones what went wrong and what could we do about it. What was the law? What did the law require versus what they thought should have been the outcome? And you know, we weren't in many, it was hard for us to try to explain to folks, we're not even litigating whether they did it or not. I mean, Mark is doing that. You know, we're not doing that. Brian's doing that. Their team is doing that. The defense team is doing it. We're not litigating guilt or innocence. We're dealing with a constitutional problem. And as prosecutors, as ethical prosecutors, that's our burden. We have to figure that out. And so it was hard. And I know at one point, you know, you wanted to say something and I had to ask the court, hey, hold him off now. Don't let him go out there. I need him to be quiet, Your Honor. And so we got a gag order on you. Okay. Because I needed time to be able to address the families and to address my office. We found we had 11 lawyers still working, or not still, but working in the office whose parents were implicated in all of this. So there was a lot going on our side that, you know, was completely different from what you all were dealing with. And the issues that you brought to the table were not always the same. We were all in search of justice, no question, but we had different roles to play. And the notion that we were just giving away the store is just ridiculous.
It is, and I have found through my in the course of the litigation that I've been doing since against this office, it's based in ignorance. It's based in them not doing their homework, right? So when I mentioned, for instance, your reentry team, which I'll describe it if you want to add to it, but you guys had a reentry team of people who interviewed several of the defendants. I did not want to do this.
Right.
I was not in favor of this, but you guys wouldn't even consider certain remedies until they went through the reentry team process. And so ultimately we did it. And that was something that happened where you guys had people who had background in assessing certain things, who talked to these guys to see whether you thought they had grown, right? Whether they had grown, whether they had rehabilitated, whether they were going to be a danger or not to society. And on top of that, in several of the cases, one of the things your office did was you made them go through risk assessments with a professional person who'd done thousands of risk assessments for the Board of Parole to determine whether they thought that these guys were going to be risks or not if they were released. And so there were multiple levels to this in terms of vetting these guys over and over again. And it wasn't just someone handing them the key to the cell and letting them walk away. And when I mentioned the reentry team at one point, it was clear that Ms. Dixon's representative who was there had no idea what that was. She wants to sweep this under the rug. She just wants to sweep it under the rug. She was asked in her 100 days press conference, and I know you saw this. She was asked in her 100 days press conference if she was still looking into the capital cases, and she said no, which was a stunning answer. That's a stunning answer because, again, either we believe in the Constitution or we don't.
Right.
And to say, I'm not going to look at these anymore. What?
Yeah.
What? Well,
yeah.
Seriously? You're just done with it?
Yeah, right.
When,
right.
There were 34 people on death row from Alameda at the time that you held your press conference on April 22nd, 2024. And of those 34, 20 have been moved off death row to different ways, right? Some have life without parole sentences. Some have been released. Many have parolable sentences somewhere in between. But there's 14 people still on death row. And the concept, which is what's being pitched by this office, the concept that somehow those 14 don't have the problem that the others have, is ludicrous. Yeah. It's absolutely ludicrous. And I have, to use a popular expression, I have the receipts. Because I have documents, right? One of the things that happened here after you held your press conference, after you guys gave us the Dyke stuff and you held the press conference, was Judge Chabria ordered that you turn over the jury selection documents from all the capital cases that you had to Ann and I for review. And we got 61,000 pages of documents. And there's a lot of stuff in there. And it's tricky, right? I know, your team was looking through this stuff, same as we were. It's tricky, right? Because different prosecutors had different ways of doing things. So some of them would, some of them would just write black right next to someone's name. Some of them would put a yellow highlight through the black jurors. Some of them would use a red dot, and so you had to piece the puzzle together to say, that's all the Jewish jurors. That's all the black jurors. They're picking them out. Right. Picking them out the way they shouldn't be, or asterisks or whatever it was. And so I have documents from some of these cases, like Chris Evans, who's still fighting to try to get off death row. Chris Evans stuff, there's terrible stuff in Chris Evans' case, right? They refer the prosecutor, in the prosecutor's notes that we got, a lesbian juror is referred to as a dyke.
I saw some of those.
Black jurors have asterisks next to their names, and their asterisks are only next to the black jurors' names. No one else's. There's stuff in his case, which is still out there. Giles Nady's case that I talked about a few minutes ago is still out there. There's clear bouts in there in Giles Nady's case, which a couple of justices on the California Supreme Court have said, we think there's bats of problem in Nady's case. So that's not just me saying that. That's not just defense attorney talk. That's, there's California Supreme Court justices who think that. So these cases that they're pushing back on, they have the same wrongs that were in the other cases. The only difference here is you have a DA who believed that it was important to have remedies for constitutional errors. And now you have a DA who does not appear to share that.
It was very clear that Ursula Jones Dixon was being brought in to take, I analogize it to like the Empire Strikes Back, right? The Empire in the form of Nancy O'Malley and Tom Orloff, and I think they even brought D. Lowell Jensen to the celebration, that they were going back to the bad old days, and she was the person to take them there. And certainly at the moment that she stepped into, as soon as she was appointed, she stepped in to stop all resentencings, not just the death penalty cases and to cover that up, but to stop all resentencings. And so there was a political agenda that was carried out. And it doesn't surprise me that the lawyers would come to court and not know anything about what we had done, because they started that process before she was sworn in. And obviously no one read the transition memorandum that we prepared, because you talk about the receipts, the documentation was there. It was quite exhaustive on each one of these cases, evaluating the notes themselves, the cases, the lawyers, putting everything in context. All of that was available to anyone who wanted to see it. And so we know that they didn't want to see it. They do want to cover it up. And so, I mean, you and I know that even before she became the DA, while she was actually still a judge, the Judge Dixon, Jones Dixon, was interfering with the resentencing process. How did you find that out?
I found that out. I was in I don't live in Alameda. That's why it's dark here. I'm sorry. I'm further east. I was in Alameda for a couple of cases on February 3rd and February 4th. And in court on February 3rd, I had one DDA who represented that they had been told that they had to moving forward with resentencings by Ursula Jones Dixon. And I was stunned because she wasn't the DA. She had been appointed the week before, but she had not taken the oath of office.
And not taken the oath.
And so I complained, right? I said, this is not right. If she wants to do that, she's got to take the oath, which she could do. She could take it right now. But that was February 3rd. And then later that same day, I heard from Amy Salway, who you mentioned earlier, another deputy district attorney, a different one from the one I had in the morning, that in a different case, it was referenced again that Ursula Jones Dixon had told them to stop moving forward with the resentencings. What's fascinating about this is that's February 3rd. And the import of that is I've seen the news out there that's happened in the last week plus about the tragic murder of parole agent Joshua Bird. And I saw that District Attorney Dixon was saying, that's your fault because she wasn't even the DA yet, right? That when this guy, when Brian Keith Hall, who's the suspect in the case, had gotten his sentencing based on his plea agreement, that wasn't her because she wasn't the DA. But that event happened 2 days after I had been told by two different DDAs that she was pulling strings and calling the shots. So it's really interesting that here, when you look at the capital cases and the recidivism rates on capital defendants are like almost zero, right? Recidivism rates, when you're talking about the population that I've been dealing with, are almost zero for so many reasons. One, they've been incarcerated for many, many years. Two, they're old, right? A lot of these guys are old, right? The youngest of the guys are in their early 50s, and then we got guys going up to their 80s, right? And so you have, for a number of reasons, very low recidivism rates. But she was concerned about the guys who had gone through years and years and years of imprisonment and rehabilitation and had statistically almost no chance of recidivism, versus looking at the cases, maybe like Mr. Hall's or others like it, where maybe there should have been more concern. I don't know. I'm not familiar with Mr. Hall's case. I'm not going to speak on it per se, other than to say she's saying there's a problem here. So I'll accept her word. If there is a problem there, then why didn't she deal with that case?
Right. She could have stopped all plea bargains at that point because she stopped everything else. And so we know that there was not enough. Where was the real concern? There was an agenda. Let's just say that.
Instead, we've gotten pushback in cases like Jack Friend. Jack Friend is a case where you guys, following meetings with your reentry team and following a risk assessment, a determination was made that Mr. Friend should be released. He's been on death row for almost 40 years. He should be released. And they are vehemently pushing back against it. And the big thing here is, and this is just, there's a fight over Mr. Friend's lack of insight into what he did. Well, Jack Friend's been there for 40 years. Jack Friend is an old man, and Jack Friend has dementia. It's hard to have insight into things when you have dementia. Right. He's also a guy who hasn't had trouble in prison. He hasn't had, this isn't a guy who's a troublemaker. He's not a danger. He's not. At this point, they're fighting to keep him in, really, because he has dementia. We don't imprison people because they have dementia. That's not what we're supposed to be doing in America, right? Is imprisoning people because they have dementia.
Yeah.
So it just, the focus here is confusing to me. And this is what we're working with in these cases. And we'll see what happens to Mr. Friend. He's got a resentencing coming up in mid-August, and we'll see what happens. But they're trying to change the terms of the resentencing. He's in a better position than many of the cases where they're trying to flat out stop the resentencing. They made a big deal in court in one case that I was litigating, where they said they used Mr. Friend's case as a case where they said we're not trying to stop them all, because look, we're going forward with Mr. Friend's case. Well, they can't stop his, because there's already been rulings made in the case, and under the law, once there's been some ruling, you can't stop it. So they're saying I am being dishonest with the court when I say they're trying to stop them all, because they're not stopping this one or they're not stopping that one, and the things they're pointing to are cases where I believe, and I've pled and filed pleadings saying this to the court, that I think they're unique cases and that they are not, in fact, doing what they're claiming they're doing. They're misleading on things here. And that's, if that's the best you have, that says something about what you're doing.
Well, it's important to shine a light on what is happening in Alameda County, because you're right. The new DA was not elected. There will be an election sometime next year, and hopefully the people of Alameda County will take a close look at what is actually happening inside the halls of justice there. So we're going to wrap now, Brian. Thank you so much for making time. Of course, thank you for shedding the light and sharing your perspective, and thank you for your pursuit of justice. It is an honor for all of us to be on the right side of justice. Thank you. Welcome to Legally Speaking. The most controversial resentencing case in the news today is that of Eric and Lyle Menendez. The Menendez brothers were arrested in 1990 for first-degree murder of their parents, Jose and Kitty Menendez. Jose and Kitty were college sweethearts, but apparently had a troubled marriage. They were extremely wealthy. They lived in a Beverly Hills mansion once owned by Elton John and Prince. But they were shot multiple times at close range with a shotgun. The murders shocked the Hollywood community and the nation. At the time of the murders in 1989, Eric was 18 and his brother Lyle was 21. Their defense was self-defense. They claimed their father had sexually abused them for years. In 1994, separate juries for both brothers deadlocked, and the courts declared a mistrial. In 1996, in a second trial, the judge barred most of the evidence of sexual abuse, and both of them were convicted of first-degree murder with special circumstances. Both brothers received 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. They were sent to separate prisons in 1996 and did not see each other again until 2018, 22 years later. In 2023, they filed writs of habeas corpus based on new evidence that their father had allegedly raped another male child, and a letter that surfaced that Eric wrote to a cousin 8 months before the murder detailing the sexual abuse by his father. Under California law, they are considered youthful offenders, but because of the way they were sentenced, they are not eligible for parole. In October of 2024, nearly 20 family members, including their mother's sister, urged then Los Angeles District Attorney George Gascon to resentence them. On October 24th, 2024, DA Gascon announced his decision to resentence both brothers to 50 years to life, which would make them eligible for parole. The DA's resentencing recommendation relied upon a number of factors. 1, their age at the time of the crime. 2, the evidence of abuse and trauma that contributed to the crime. And 3, their record in prison. According to the Los Angeles Times, both brothers have been deeply involved in rehabilitation programs and projects to care for disabled inmates and improve life inside the prison for both staff and inmates. Lyle earned a bachelor's degree in sociology from UC Irvine and is working on a master's degree in urban development. Eric is set to graduate as well from UC Irvine with a degree in sociology. According to one resentencing and reentry expert, both brothers have excellent prison records, with no evidence of violence or gang affiliation over 35 years. Just like Alameda County, however, in 2024, the new tough-on-crime DA reversed course and opposed any opportunity for the Menendez brothers to be resentenced or receive a new trial. In March, Los Angeles' new tough-on-crime DA moved to withdraw DA Gascon's motion for resentencing, calling the brothers liars and stating that they do not meet the standards for resentencing. In April, after a hearing where the new DA spent hours showing graphic crime scene photos from 35 years ago, re-traumatizing the family members who were present, the court denied his motion. In May, the court resentenced the Menendez brothers based on the original recommendation of 50 years to life. The new tough-on-crime DA also opposed their effort to have a new trial based on the new evidence, arguing that the new evidence of sexual abuse is neither credible or admissible. In July, however, the Los Angeles Superior Court ordered him to explain why the conviction should not be re-examined based on the new evidence. The court does not agree that the evidence is untimely and inadmissible, as argued by the new DA. Making the Menendez brothers eligible for parole does not mean they will be released anytime soon. The parole board is not obligated to grant them parole. In fact, in California, only 14% of all applicants were granted parole in 2022, and less than 15% granted parole on their first review. And when parole is denied, incarcerated people in California have to wait a minimum of 3 years up to 15 years for the next parole hearing. Prosecutors have a huge influence when they show up to oppose parole. Undoubtedly, when the Menendez brothers go to the parole board this month, the new DA, tough on crime, will be there, arguing against parole and against the family's wishes. Typically, family members represented by lawyers also show up to oppose any grant of parole. The Menendez case is unusual in that this family is united in favor of releasing the brothers. So just like Alameda County is facing the ghost of past injustice, Los Angeles is also dealing with a case that is over 35 years old and may have resulted in a huge miscarriage of justice. While the Menendez brothers' claims that they were denied a fair trial do not rest on race or unconstitutional conduct by prosecutors, the case illuminates the challenges of a broken criminal justice system in almost every other way. Either you believe in the Constitution or you don't. On May 1st, 2025, I joined thousands of lawyers and millions of workers around the world to protest the actions of the United States government under the regime of Donald Trump. I have been a constitutional lawyer for more than 40 years, so I was happy to join the thousands of lawyers in Oakland and across California who gathered to renew our oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the state of California. My guest this week, attorney Brian Pomerantz, put it bluntly when speaking about the policies of the new tough-on-crime Alameda County District Attorney. Either you believe in the Constitution or you don't. The very frightening conclusion is that the new tough-on-crime DA in my beloved Alameda does not believe in the Constitution. That's consistent with the prevailing MAGA view of the law that values politics and punishment over justice. The Constitution, under the strategic leadership of civil rights attorney and law professor Charles Hamilton Houston, became a living document for our country. Until Houston attacked the doctrine of separate but equal and forced the Supreme Court to take up the challenges of due process under the 14th Amendment, the Constitution and the country were stuck in a time warp. We celebrate the decision of Brown versus Board of Education of 1954, but that was just the beginning of the story. The Supreme Court heard arguments again and issued Brown 2 in May of 1955. That's when the fight to desegregate the schools got real for school districts. Hamilton's protege, Thurgood Marshall, had to get a court order in 1956 to force the University of Alabama to admit Autherine Lucy, its first African-American student. White students and residents in Alabama rioted when the court issued that order. Autherine Lucy was suspended and later expelled for criticizing the university. When the Warren Court issued Brown versus Board of Education, the resistance was immediate and massive. There was something called the Southern Manifesto and the Massive Resistance Doctrine, which included a law that punished any public school that integrated by eliminating its state funds and eventually closing the school. Many public schools were defunded and closed rather than comply with the Supreme Court's decision. Still, Brown was a watershed moment for the Constitution. Within the next 10 years following its decision in Brown versus Board of Education, the Warren Court ruled that police could not use evidence obtained in unconstitutional searches, a violation of the Fourth Amendment, required the police to inform a person arrested of their right to remain silent, the Fifth Amendment, and required states to provide a lawyer to people charged with a crime who could not afford a private lawyer, the Sixth Amendment. During his time on the court from 1953 to 1969, Justice Earl Warren literally attacked the injustices in our criminal justice system and did his part to make crooked paths straight. He was joined on the Supreme Court by Justice Thurgood Marshall in 1967, who carried the torch for justice until he retired in 1991. Since the dramatic days of Justice Warren and Charles Hamilton Houston and Justice Thurgood Marshall, the United States has had a rich history in constitutional law and a major impact on the world in sharing our constitutional principles. Since January of 2025, however, Donald Trump has used his executive power to rewrite the Constitution based on his allegiance to Project 2025. The breadth of his attack on the Constitution is overwhelming. Back in the days of Hamilton, Houston, and Warren and Marshall, there was a commitment to the Constitution and using the law to improve the lives of our people. That is the benchmark that we must use to measure the current state of fascism nationally and the dismantling of progressive reforms locally. Either you believe in the Constitution or you don't. Thanks for tuning in to Pamela Price Unfiltered. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And please sign up this month as a founding member or a paid subscriber to my Substack newsletter to get the weekly word from Pamela Price Unfiltered. Your support keeps the conversation raw and unfiltered. And you can also listen to Pamela Price Unfiltered wherever you get your podcasts.